go. All right. Can you all please take your seats? Fasten your seatbelts, please. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Martin Enserink. I'm the international news editor at Science magazine. And thank you, first of all, for being here. We know it's been a long day, interesting but long, and some of you are probably hungry or thirsty or tired. And so we appreciate that you're sticking around for this final session. And we think it's a good one. The idea for this session came from Yves Siama, the president of the French Association of Science Writers, but we've organized it together. As Yves said this morning, we need to be obsessed about ethics. I don't know if you are obsessed about ethics. I don't think all of us are. We both felt that when it comes to conflicts of interest in science, a lot of science journalists are not really paying all that much attention. Maybe sometimes they are, but we feel sometimes people are missing stories, or sometimes we're perhaps too gullible. We sometimes see these disclosures at the end of a paper. We know that industry money influences science, but some people also sometimes just ignore it or find it inconvenient. We don't always know what to do with it, was our impression. So that's why we decided to organize this session. And we've invited two researchers who've studied conflicts of interest in nutrition and medical science, especially, and in medicine, and two journalists who have a long track record of covering conflicts of interest and also the effect of corporate lobbying on science and regulation. We hope they can all make us a little bit wiser, sadder and wiser perhaps, and maybe a little bit less naive. They will each speak for about 10 minutes. They've promised to keep it short so that we have time for your questions at the end. So I'll move right along to the first speaker. She is Marion Nestle. She is a nutritionist, a nutrition scientist, a professor emerita at New York University. She's also a consumer advocate and the author of many award-winning books. She blogs. You may also know her from her appearance in documentary films like Super Size Me, Food Inc., and Fed Up. And she has a new book out in the fall, which I'm sure she's going to tell you about. We're very happy that Marion traveled all the way from New York City to be with us today.
Oh. Thank you, Martin. I'm very, very happy to be here because journalists have a very important role to play in this story. As you can tell from this slide, I write about food politics, and my forthcoming book, which is coming out at the end of October, is about how food companies skew the science of what we eat. And as you'll see, the role of journalists in this is extremely important. And let me start with a New York Times story, March 17th this year, which was an enormous article, riveting article, about how the National Institutes of Health in the United States actually courted the alcohol industry to pay for a study that would demonstrate the benefits of one drink of alcohol a day. 5 companies donated $67 million, and the whole thing raised questions about how the study was designed, what the research question was, what the promised outcome of the study was. It had implications for alcohol guidelines and the integrity of the National Institutes of Health. A lot of things happened very rapidly. In March, the NIH said that it would investigate. In April, there were calls for stopping the trial, and in May, the NIH stopped enrollment in the trial. When the investigative report came out in June, the NIH stopped the trial because, as this particular press account said, the controversial NIH study of moderate drinking was terminated after a scathing review. So journalists got this story started and got this trial stopped. My book began with journalism. It began with a story by Anna Hatt O'Connor of the New York Times about Coca-Cola's funding of a group of researchers who were telling everybody that exercise was more important than what you eat in obesity, an idea so far from the truth that even Fox News was shocked by it. The story had also enormous effects. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but the main one was that it was enormously embarrassing to Coca-Cola, and the CEO of Coca-Cola wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal saying that they were going to do better moving forward, and they would become transparent. And in fact, they have done that to the extent that they can. And on their website, if you Google Coca-Cola transparency, this searchable website will come up that lists every organization and every individual that Coca-Cola funds, or at least knows its funds. Well, the problem with transparency is that it enables analysis. And one such analysis looked at papers and research studies that examined the questions, are sugary drinks related to obesity or diabetes? And the investigators found 26 studies that said no, it has no relation. Every single one of them was funded by Coca-Cola or some other soda company. They found 34 studies that said yes, there was a relationship, and of those, only one was funded by industry. And you can bet that the investigator of that study never got funded again. The second impetus for my book was a kind of an exercise that I went through from March 2015 to March 2016, when so annoyed by industry-funded studies with results favorable to the sponsor, I started posting them on my website every time I collected 5. And at the end of the year, I had collected 168 studies, and of them, 156 had results favorable to the sponsor's interest. Only 12 were unfavorable. This was a convenient sample. It was just what I ran across. It wasn't particularly systematic, but it still produced a lot of information that I thought was really interesting, one of which was the enormous variety of food companies, trade associations that were funding studies that would produce results that they could use in marketing or use to protect their products. And this is an enormous list. I will not read it. But you can see at a glance that lots and lots and lots of different kinds of foods and drinks and companies are involved. Here's one example. It happens to be a personal favorite. Dietary flavonoid intake and the incidence of erectile dysfunction. The authors who did this study were funded by the U.S. Blueberry Highbush Council for a different project, but this led to a press release, blueberries associated with reduced risk of erectile dysfunction, and the press picked that up. Maybe blueberries can help. Wouldn't that be nice? The research on funding effects in the tobacco, drug, and chemical industry, I can't even describe how enormous the research base is. It started in the 1970s, or maybe even earlier. For the drug industry, it started in the 1970s. And the results have been remarkably consistent. Sponsored research favors the sponsor. Gifts have influence, no matter how small they are. The influence is generally unconscious, unintentional. It's not recognized. It's usually denied. The justifications for taking the money are similar. Disclosure is necessary but not sufficient, and prevention and management are essential. And I'm showing here the cover of Science magazine this week. Good timing, Martin. On conflicts of interest. There's tremendous interest in it over a very long time. Research on nutrition funding effects, in contrast, is absolutely minimal. I was able to identify only 11 studies in comparison to the thousands that have been done on funding effects for these other industries. These vary enormously in the product that they're looking at, although 6 of them looked at sugary drinks. They vary in the health effect that they were looking at, the methods and the outcome. But overall, they generally favor the sponsor, and they demonstrate that the research question is the point of vulnerability. It's where the problem really lies, and also that they tend to give a positive spin on neutral or negative results. So very consistent with the other studies. The The scientific risks in industry funding, I think, are enormous. There's no question that industry funding biases the research agenda and the interpretation of the results. It distorts dietary advice for the public, and it induces a great deal of distrust. The risk to researchers who take industry funding are also large, and I think largely unrecognized. They can be exposed in the press, embarrassed, they can appear to be sold out, and there are opportunity costs. There are things they're not allowed to do because they're taking industry funding. And journalists have a really important role to play here, and let me give you a couple of examples of really good work by journalists. This is a study of the association of candy consumption with measures of body weight and other health risk factors for cardiovascular disease in children and adolescents. The conclusion of that study, which was funded by the National Confectioners Association, was that candy is really okay for kids, and kids who eat candy are healthier than ones who don't. Candace Choi of the Associated Press wrote a really enormously important investigative report on how candy makers shape the science of nutrition around their products. Julia Belluz of Vox is another person who's been doing really terrific work on this. She had a study recently on how flawed science funded by Nestle, no relation by the way, Mars, Kaibo, and Hershey's demonstrated that eating chocolate not only reduces the risk for heart disease, but helps you fight Alzheimer's, and she does a terrific analysis of what was wrong with those studies and why those studies are questionable, usually in the way the research question was designed. So before you read another health study, please, please, please check to see who's funding the research. And I think it's an important issue because of the discussion in the last panel, for those of you who had it. There are many, many reasons why investigators say that they take money from industry. We need the sponsorship. It's just a pen. It doesn't influence me. It's just a gift. The science is what counts. And Daniel Goldberg, who's an ethicist at the University of Colorado, did this conflict of interest bingo card as a satire of all of this because he was so tired of hearing the excuses. The one that he didn't talk about is one that we've heard several times today, and that is that career or ideological biases are the same or worse as industry funding. And I want to speak to that because I think they're really quite different. Industry funding is extrinsic to the scientific process. You don't have to do it. It's discretionary. And the results of industry-funded research are almost invariably unidirectional. They tend to favor the sponsor. That is not true of career or ideological biases, which are different, are intrinsic to the research process. Everybody has them, and you can't do science without them. So I think industry funding is something that really needs to be paid very close attention to. Health News Review, which is a soon-to-be extinct organization on the web that advises how to analyze research and has a set of review criteria for reviewing scientific studies that are really worth looking at. One of their questions is who funded the research. It's always an important question, and urges journalists to report conflicted interests and always to use independent sources. So I'll stop here and just say that my book is coming out October 30th. If you're interested in covering it in any way, pick up one of these cards and just write the publisher and get a review copy, and they'll send out advance copies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that excellent sales pitch.
I tried.
Fantastic talk. Our next speaker is Marc Rodwin. He's a lawyer, professor of health law at Suffolk University Law School, which is in Boston. Marc has studied conflicts of interest in medicine for decades, I think. He's the author of several books about the topic. He has looked at the issue not just in the US, but also compared the situation there to France and to Japan. He has done many other things, including assisting consumer groups. He has actually just spent the last year not too far from Toulouse at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Marseille. Marc, go ahead.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here. I got into this after following work of journalists, but also because of an issue in my own law practice that made me think about conflicts of interest. So I'm going to speak about 5 points, because my last point was on journalists, and in light of the previous panel, I'll skip that. How do I move forward on this? Should I come up? I can.
Okay. Let's do it.
I want to say a little bit about what a conflict interest is and why we should worry about it, get into some definitions, give some examples of conflicts of interest in medicine and science, note what I think is the key policy now for science journalism, which is the integrity of scientific research, discuss briefly what is often viewed as a solution disclosure. It's really a necessary tool. It's not a remedy. It can make things worse if viewed as a solution. So it's worth focusing on that, I think. And then I want to say just a word or two about how one can cope with conflicts of interest. I'll end with that. So if we can move to the first slide, just for a minute to give an intuitive idea, think of the analogy of a person judging their own case. Can a person judge themselves? Even if a person is able to, is it rational or prudent to allow a person to be a judge of their own case? Most of us would say there's a problem or potential problem there. The next slide, please. To get to a legal angle, should a judge or an arbitrator be paid by one side? They're judging. And in most legal systems, there's a norm that you can't do that, and we understand that they can't. And that's extended even further. We would also say in all courts of law that a judge can't be deciding a case involving a relative, a family member. They're viewed as too close. And so this idea of a conflict of interest in law, and it is a legal idea, has been extended to other areas of public life, to other professionals too. And here let me just pause and say, although the ethicists have gotten into the act and now have a literature on conflicts of interest, this is essentially a legal idea. It's been around and defined in the law for 100, 150 years. It comes out of fiduciary law, which comes out of the law of trust and estates and agency. It then came into a public employment law. It became part of financial law for the Securities Act and corporate law in the US. Just for example, corporate law treatises have 1/3 of their work on conflicts of interest. More recently, it's been extended to other areas. The Encyclopedia of Bioethics, first edition, didn't have an entry on conflicts of interest in 1978, not one, and it was 5 volumes. The second volume had a number of entries. So we can redefine it however one wants, but it does have a legal tradition, and that's my way of looking at it. And I'll get to that too, because there's some debates about and what I call efforts to redefine conflicts of interest. I think it's time to the next slide. So for a definition, let me just say that a conflict of interest, and I'm giving the example of physicians from a slide I have, but you can say journalist or scientist or researcher. It exists in 2 different kind of situations. The classic kind is a financial conflict of interest, where you have the actor having a financial incentive to act in one way, and the actor having an obligation, a legal obligation, a moral obligation to act for a certain party, to be loyal, to perform a certain duty, and the conflict between the financial incentive and their obligation. Now notice it's an incentive. It doesn't mean you've actually acted. It's a risk factor. So you have conflicts of interest without breach of trust or misconduct. It's just something that raises an issue. There are also what are called divided loyalty conflicts of interest, and there, in theory, you can have no financial stake, but just two competing roles. So in science, the classic example is a physician researcher who is treating a cancer patient and then wants to enroll them in a clinical trial, and the patient may think that it's getting treatment, but when you're a human research subject, the aims of science are to produce knowledge, not to cure a person. The obligations of the researcher are different. The two roles conflict. Maybe it's a good thing for the patient to enter a trial if there's no other thing, but to have a researcher do two at the same time is a conflict of interest. So that's the kind of the paradigm, and I think you have that in other areas of science and life too. And let me now give an example, a classic example from medicine. Take the example of a physician who also dispenses medication. In one role, the physician prescribes the medicine, but as a dispenser of medicine, which exists in Japan and in Switzerland and in the US a little bit, they make money off of doing that. And so the issue is whether that financial incentive would lead you to distort your prescribing behavior. And you can see those are two different roles, or there's a financial incentive, and we can talk about whether it can be controlled by disclosure or not. But that's an example, and you can see that the health system has dealt with that in various ways. So in Japan, that's how doctors made their money traditionally, and it was put into the codes of ethics of reimbursement. Until very recently, they still made most of their money. In France, they've gone the opposite extreme. You can't even prescribe a vaccine in France and dispense it. You have to go to a pharmacy, come back, and have the doctor do it. So the conflict can exist. The system can acknowledge it. Maybe we get used to it, but there is something there. So let me give a few other examples in medicine to the next slide. In medicine, I like to divide, and my book is full of examples, the medicine, money, and morals, and physician and conflicts of interest in the future of medicine. One aspect is where you have physicians as entrepreneurs, and they practice medicine, but they own facilities or hospitals or MRI centers or the like. And so there again, they have an entrepreneurial role to sell things. And there are distinctions that could be made because you could sell just ancillary services or a whole bunch of them. A second category is employment. You could be a physician as an employee, have a conflict, and you work for a for-profit company and have to get measured for the productivity of the company. You're an employee, not an entrepreneur, but the employer may tell you to produce for them. That's very different if you're, say, in a public hospital as an employee and have a certain independence in what you do. A third element has to do is if you're receiving payment, how you get paid is if you're a doctor. So you can have fee-for-service payment and get paid for doing lots of things, or you can be in managed care in the US and get incentives for reducing services. But there are a number of payment conflicts, and if you're interested, there's a lot that I say about that. And then physicians sometimes have ties to third parties, insurers, or providers. And a lot of the debate is about the ties to providers of medicines, pharmaceutical companies, but all these ties can influence the physician judgment. And maybe this is a time to go back and fill in the two definitions that I gave before, because I talked about the categories of conflict of interest, but the basic problem is that when you have these divided loyalties or financial incentives, it can compromise your loyalty. It can compromise your independent judgment. And if you're supposed to act in one role and have this other role or financial incentive, that puts into question, and that's what a conflict of interest is. You can have that conflict and act appropriately, but the conflict is there even if you act appropriately. And the conflict means that there's a risk, and perhaps we as society should prevent you from getting into that role or acting in it, or at least monitor your contact to do it. But the conflict of interest is separate from the action. So let me go and just look a few things. These are sometimes old. Here's a Daumier print from 1800. The doctor dispensing medicine. His consultations are free, but he charges for the medicine and, of course, for the 2 bottles deposit. And Daumier makes fun of it back then. Another example, more modern for the next slide. This is fee-for-service medicine, the doctor having incentive to have too many acts and taking out all the teeth, also from the 18th century. The third slide, next one, is the more modern one, healthcare financial management. The doctor scratching the back of the hospital, and they're talking about physician relation programs benefiting doctors, patients, and no one mentions the patient because they're not in this picture. So that's separate. This is the sponsored content issue. The doctor was a NASCAR driver with all sorts of activities on it. So you can see that journalists and cartoonists have picked up in 2 things, and here's another one. So those are a few examples, and here's the one, gifts from industry. The doctor discloses to the patient that this may cause weight gain, and the patient curiously asks how, and they say, well, I get paid for prescribing this or wined and dined, and so I may get fat. Full disclosure. So those are kind of a few examples, and what I'd like to turn to now is this idea of intellectual conflicts of interest. Next slide. In recent years, there's been a number of people who have tried to make an idea that everything's equivalent, that we all have conflicts of interest, and that everyone has an interest. And there's a huge literature on it. And I ignored it for a long time because it just didn't seem worth bothering with. But what I've written an article about now is saying that it's not the way it's been used in the law traditionally. And there's some good policy reasons not to adopt this as a change in the law, even though a lot of the medical profession, the Institute of Medicine, and others have adopted something that would allow intellectual conflicts of interest. And as Marion mentioned, there really are some significant differences. It's a lot easier to manage the financial conflicts. There's a tradition of doing it. There is a value of having different intellectual interest frameworks and schools of thought, and having diversity. You can identify those, particularly because of what people write and publish, which you can't when you have financial interests. This is not to say that we shouldn't...
Almost at the end, sorry.
Okay, not to say that we should have no worry about bias, but do it in another way. So now disclosure. Next slide. Well, the key problem for science journalism is all the studies now for pharmaceuticals and others are pretty much funded by industry. And this really is a structural problem that needs to be addressed, because you have the whole intellectual base of our knowledge is compromised. And that can't be dealt with simply by disclosing interests or dealing with individual conflicts of interest researcher, but needs a social solution in terms of how we fund things. So if I'm over, I can fund there, and if someone asks me questions, I'll tell a little bit about the other things I wanted to say.
Let's end it there, because we also want the next 2 speakers to have their time. And
sure.
If there are questions, we'll get back to that. Our next speaker, excuse me, is Stéphane Horel. She is a researcher, investigative journalist, and for Le Monde, among other things. She is also a documentary filmmaker. She's worked a lot on corporate lobbying in Brussels, has made a career out of it, you could say, and she's won several awards. Stéphane lists on her website one of her inspirations is Mary Poppins, and one of her life goals is changing the world. So I'm curious to hear how that's going.
Well, I think I failed so far. So I apologize for those who, because it's the second session, I talk about my work, so I apologize for this. And I just wanted to summarize what I did before. And I didn't decide at some point to work on conflicts of interest and lobbying. It was a process, and the process started with a work on the pharmaceutical industry in France. Then it was followed by a dive into the endocrine disrupting chemicals issue from a public health point of view. Then the food lobby, and then I started looking into the chemicals issue again, and after several years looking into these stories, I realized it was always the same tactics, the same strategies used, and I was recognizing the same patterns. So instead of reinventing the wheel, I started reading about these strategies, because there are many books, many scholar works, including those the work done by Marion Nestle and Marc Rodwin, but there are also many books that are totally accessible to that people can read, and that I read, and I started using that as an investigative tool. So from 2012 to 2016, I followed a lobbying battle in Brussels against the regulation of endocrine disrupting compounds. There was a pesticides regulation adopted in 2009, and in which there was a very severe point saying that pesticides that are endocrine disruptors should be removed from the market. But the European Commission had to decide what was an endocrine disruptor, how you isolate, how you identify an EDC, endocrine disrupting compound, from the whole chemical soup. So this battle was about finding the right words to identify EDC, and usually this is how what lobbying is about. It's about choosing words and writing the law. In Brussels, there's this mantra. Everybody talks about science-based policy making, but actually what we have seen on many files, and especially on the EDC one, is someone said that it was an advisor for the Greens at the Parliament. He said it's more evidence-based policy making. So I'm going to tell you one infamous episode of this battle, which happened in 2013. So this EDC definition had to be adopted by the end of 2013. And in the middle of June 2013, as the DG Environment, that is the Directorate General for the Environment of the European Commission, who was in charge for this work, they were chef de file, as they say in the Brussels bubble, and they had adopted a precautionary approach as the law was requiring, and it was at the great displeasure of industry, and there was huge lobbying against this idea, this proposal of regulation by DG Environment. And in the middle of this extremely tense situation, you have the DG Environment finalizing its proposal. There's a battle inside the Commission because all the other services didn't want DG Environment to finalize this proposal, and a huge lobbying. You've got this very, very unusual lobbying thing, or unusual thing that happens. You've got Anne Glover, who was the unique chief scientific advisor of the history of the EU for the moment. She received a letter in the middle of this lobbying battle, signed by 56 scientists, explaining to her that something was wrong about the upcoming regulation, and that the approach made by DG Environment was too precautionary. Next slide. A couple of weeks later, there's an editorial published in 14 journals, scientific journals, at the same time, signed by 18 editors or chief editors of journals, with saying exactly the same thing as the letter. The letter to Anne Glover was as an attachment of this editorial. So you can, I think, enjoy the title, which is extremely scientific, about this, about its attacking without even quoting the reference of the document it attacks, this upcoming regulation. There was no disclosure in this, in none of these 14 journals that published the editorial had a disclosure. So I had a look into this. It's not extremely difficult investigation to do. It just takes time. You check every declaration of interest that these scientists have made in journals or in agencies. And what I found out is that 17 of the 18 editors had industry ties. And if you take the 56 signatories of the letter and the editors altogether, that makes a group of 68 scientists, because some signed both, and 50 of them had industry ties, which is statistically significant in terms of what the result, I would say. And what was very interesting also is that 25 of them were putting forward in their signature the fact that they were part of an expert panel, an official one, an EU one. So there's this question of who are they talking in? Are they talking in the name of themselves, of their institution, or are they talking because they are European official experts for the Commission? So that's the basics in lobbying. It's we say it's sending the right message to the right person at the right moment. And what happened next is that Anne Glover, I'm not saying that she did that intentionally, but she had somehow, because she was this new person at this new post, she had to invent it. She didn't know what to do really about this post. She thought she had to copy everyone important in the Commission about this thing. So the upper level of the Commission was informed immediately that there was a problem with this upcoming and this regulation proposal at DG Environment, and it was used as a pretext by the Secretary General, which is the super high level of the Commission at the administrative level, to delay the regulation. So there was the regulation was totally derailed in July, at the beginning of July, that is 15 days later, 15 days after this letter was sent. And the deadline, which was set in September 2013, was not respected. And if you have followed this EDC saga, the final criteria were only adopted at the end of 2017, after the Commission was condemned by the EU Court of Justice for violating the law of the European Union because of this delay. And so you see that this letter and the editorial were a completely engineered controversy, but was presented by the Commission as a scientific controversy, just in order to justify the fact that they were not regulating severely endocrine disruptors. And so that was this episode in 2013, but it was not the only one related to journals. And I think there's an immense responsibility of journals today. Disclosures don't work. They are not exhaustive. Nobody checks the veracity of disclosures. And this is one example. As you can see, it's also a very scientific title, Endocrine Disruption, Fact or Urban Legend. With the amount of research there is on this issue, publishing something, I mean, it's not an editorial, it's a research article. There's obviously a problem with such a title. You have 4 authors. One of them is one of the editors. So it's always the same people. The first author, they all have affiliations that are incorrect. The first one says he's just a citizen living at Les Caillons, and in fact he's a research director for L'Oréal, the cosmetics group. Christopher Bogert signs as a fellow scientist for the Florida University, I think. I can't remember, but it's the only article in his whole career that he signed with this affiliation, because usually he's signed with the name of his consulting company, because he's a private consultant. So how is it possible that with the knowledge we have of conflicts of interest, journals would publish things like that with a disclosure that's completely empty? Maybe one clue about this is that Daniel Dietrich, the third author, is also a member of the editorial board, and that the chief editor of Toxicology Letters was one of the editors, and he was the one who sent the letter to Anne Glover. And last thing I wanted to say, it's not only small journals or journals that you don't know very much, like Toxicology Letters. There are very prominent journals which are also used for this science washing of lobbying material. I think this science washing campaign that companies use to influence decision making you should bear in mind that all the time. And for example, you see it's the same person, Daniel Dietrich, it's the same persons who signed the letter to Anne Glover. It's always the same people, and they used the correspondence section of Nature to publish a letter attacking, this time not the commission, but published literature by top scientists, members of the Endocrine Society. And what's interesting is that when I had a look into this, I read the policy of Nature on disclosures, and do they check? Do you have to disclose your conflicts when you write only a letter? And what happens? And then I found out that it's Nature that decides of the titles. And I think there's something disturbing here, that Nature would let scientists who have been involved in lobbying operations previously publish a letter in Nature with an empty disclosure, and choosing themselves a word like pseudoscience to attack legitimate public science that was peer-reviewed.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting work and thought-provoking findings that we should discuss. Please save your questions until the last speaker. And the last speaker is Deborah Cohen. She's an associate editor at the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal. She has reported extensively for television as well, including Panorama, Newsnight, Channel 4 News. And she has worked with the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine and on collaborative work with them. Deborah is one of the very few journalists that I know who has her own conflicts of interest page online at the BMJ. I checked it to see what it said. It's not all that interesting, but it does say she will occasionally accept necessary and reasonable travel and accommodation for not-for-profit organizations. And we're very happy that she did that to be at this meeting.
That one. Okay, oh, there we go, there I am. First of all, I apologise for the quality of my slides. I'm a journalist and not a slide maker. And also I apologise for my accent. I'm from Liverpool, so if I talk quickly, that is why. So I've come at journalism in quite an interesting route. So I initially trained to be a doctor, a physician. I then worked on the BMJ for years. I am actually freelance now, but I've worked in the bowels of the beasts. And I've also worked in academia at Oxford University, where the head of the department was taking money from the company of the drug I was investigating. That wasn't awkward. And then I've worked across the mainstream media. But the first big story I worked on was Tamiflu. Has everyone heard of Tamiflu? Yeah, influenza drug. Now, just a general question, totally unscientific straw poll. Who, if they are taking a drug or are stockpiling a drug would want to know as much about the benefits and the harms as they possibly could. Is that controversial? You wouldn't have thought so. And another question, if you are developing guidelines for clinical practice or scientific medical policy, do you want those people who are producing those guidelines to have marketed the drug that they are producing the guidelines about? In other words, do you want them to be on the payroll of the company that makes the drug? Anyone think that's a good idea? Back at the time I did this, it was so controversial. Both of these stories were incredibly controversial. And I think sometimes as a journalist, and this is the hard thing, is you sometimes have to make yourself extremely unpopular. And not just unpopular with people you're criticising, but it comes from surprising places, including other journalists and journals and publications. And I'll touch on a little bit about that. I won't go as far to name them, but I'll just leave it out there. So 2009, what was happening in 2009? We had a pandemic. And the Cochrane collaboration, has everyone heard of Cochrane? So Cochrane, the collaboration, are a group of nominally independent academics. Some of them have conflicts of interest, but what they do are things called systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And I realise everyone's science journalists here, but in essence, you pull together evidence on a particular subject across the literature. And Cochrane tends to focus on randomised control trials. But anyway, a previous review that they'd done, they'd said that influenza reduces the risk of secondary complications. Now, I don't know how much people know about influenza, but sometimes it's the virus that can kill. But also what happens is you develop secondary complications, pneumonia, for example, and this is often what kills you if you have a severe dose of influenza. So you can imagine during a pandemic, lots of people getting influenza. You can imagine stockpiling a drug that can do this. Fantastic, because vaccines take a while to develop, so there's a bit of a lag. If you've got a drug that can do this in place of that, fantastic idea. And here's our friend Bill Burns, who was the CEO of Roche, and he told a global audience via CNBC, it's not only can it reduce secondary complications, but it can reduce hospitalizations by more than 60%. Now again, if you've got people that are getting very sick, you might need to put them in intensive care, and you have a drug that can reduce that by 60%, the burden on your health service, fantastic. Why wouldn't you stockpile this drug? And look, if you see at the bottom, they've been, WHO has been recommending it, the product, for years, and so have governments. So anyway, Cochrane collaboration realised that they had to do their review. And soon they realised there was some strange things happening with the medical literature. So they found a review article. So in the first systematic review that had been done several years previously, they'd found a review article. Now, it's a review article and not a systematic review. They're slightly different. And it found that influenza can reduce lower respiratory tract complications, so things like pneumonia, and associated antibiotic use, and the risk of hospitalisation. And what happened with this review? Well, it was pointed out to them that it was manufacturer funded, and it included 10 manufacturer-funded RCTs from the late 1990s, only 2 of which have ever been published. So there were 8 unpublished clinical trials. Is that a good idea? That you've got all these trials done? And from a purely ethical perspective, a trial participant often goes into a trial for altruistic reasons. There's an ethical duty to publish those data if someone has been a participant in effectively an experiment. But there are other things that are a bit interesting. So there are all these funny different conclusions about what the trial literature said. Now bear in mind there were only 2 published randomised control trials. And at this point we know there are about 10. So there were different groups of people, so two different camps. So there was one camp, and that was HHS in the US, the CDC, the European Medicines Agency, Australian regulator, Therapeutic Goods Administration, Roche, Cochrane, 2006. They all believed that Tamiflu could do these things, that it was going to reduce hospitalizations and it was going to reduce pneumonia. However, the FDA, the Japanese authorities, Tamiflu.com, which is the US website, so regulated in the US, Roche.com is a European website, and Cochrane 2009 said, we can't prove this. So the FDA had never allowed a claim that Tamiflu can reduce secondary complications. And I won't go into the nuts and bolts, but it all comes down to how the European Medicines Agency and the FDA deal with data differently. So we thought, right, okay, we need more oversight. We need to see what's really going on. So I worked very closely with the Cochrane collaboration and Channel 4 News to track down the data. So we thought, best thing to do is go to the lead author of the review article. Do you remember this review article that I mentioned? This one that had the 10 RCTs. So I thought, well, you know, he's lead author. You have a duty. If you are a lead author to have some ownership of the data, you might have it. You should have access. You should have seen it. You sign criteria when you submit publications to medical journals. So we emailed him. We thought, okay, let's see if we can get the trial data from him. And the first thing he said was, I suggest to contact Roche directly to get access to the files. In other words, he didn't have access to the files. So then we thought we'd try the other independent, and I use that advisedly, author on the review. The other authors were all Roche employees who had done the statistical analyses. And he went to find the data, and he'd moved offices, and basically the dog had eaten his homework. So he'd apparently lost all these files containing data, which we all know was probably not a good thing. So anyway, again, he told us to go to Roche to find the data. So then we thought we'd go to the two published RCTs. One was in JAMA, I think, and the other one was in The Lancet. And we went to the lead authors of these original randomized control trials, and nobody had seen the data. Neither of the key authors had seen the data. So here's a drug, and I know in the UK alone, during that period of time, we'd stockpiled to the tune of £500 million. And there were fights over who were going to get the supplies of Tamiflu. But who'd actually seen the data? And this is why conflicts of interest matter. So at the same time, we all like a whistleblower, and I got a whistleblower. I was quite lucky. And she was British, and she worked for a company called ADIS International. They're part of Walters Kluwer. I've probably said that wrong, and I apologise. And she was a ghostwriter. And she sent me a copy of a contract, and she sent me a copy of everything that she'd had to ghostwrite. And she was supposed to edit original articles, letters, editorials for drugs, and she'd worked on the Tamiflu account. So she'd worked on those papers that appeared in the medical journals. She hadn't been named, she hadn't been disclosed. And now in journals, you're supposed to disclose if you use a professional writer. And she also had marketing material. And in a contract, she was supposed to put the same buzzwords in the marketing material as in the published articles. So what they wanted to stress in the marketing material was it reduces secondary complications. And so those key phrases went across from marketing to the medical journals. And what was interesting is the marketing material started before Tamiflu, which the generic name is oseltamivir, was even called oseltamivir. So in drug development, I'm sure you know, it's given a funny number before it's given its generic name. So they were already marketing and hyping up Tamiflu well before it had even got into phase 3 clinical trials. And phase 3 clinical trials is really where you get the generic name.
Sorry to interrupt, but your time is almost up.
Okay, so very quickly, I found that these people had been advising governments, WHO, and so on and so forth. So they also had, they were also with the European Scientific Working Group on Influenza that receives industry money, and their whole job, and we had part of their plans, was to lobby governments to stockpile Tamiflu. The experts were members of ESWI. They were also funded by Roche. And they also advised WHO. So WHO were advising stockpiling, and the person who was advising them was the people that had been doing the clinical trials and marketing Tamiflu. It's actually quite genius when you think about it. You think Roche have been very, very clever. And we asked WHO for the conflicts of interest statements, and they were unable to provide any. So we asked the experts if they provided any, and they were unable to provide any. So we wrote a story on it. And the conflicted experts went above and beyond. They went to the European Medicines Agency, again, no conflict of interest declarations, and also the Swedish state public health and Belgian public health, and none of them were able to provide conflict of interest statements. And in the end, it turns out that there were 74 clinical trials. So there was more than the 10, there was 74. So you had people, effectively experts, be wary of experts who were effectively marketing the drug, putting their names on journals, advising governments about what to do with the drug that they were marketing. And when it came out, I have to say, I almost went into hiding, because it was, and believe it or not, the WHO story was more controversial than the fact that we haven't got a clue. We don't have access to the evidence of what most of our drugs do. So that's in a nutshell, and that's why conflicts of interest matter, because they can take us on a journey, perhaps, where we don't want to be scientifically. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's a fascinating case. Thank you. All right, let's see if this raised any questions. Please identify yourself. Please keep your questions brief, because we don't have a whole lot of time. And if the people in the front can just use the microphone, I think in the back you'll have to find somebody with a microphone. Christy?
Hi, Christy Oshwin with 538. I've heard said several times today, in a previous panel, someone actually said that disclosure was a solution to conflicts of interest. Everyone here is saying that it's not. That seems to be a common experience. And so I'm just wondering, if disclosure is not a solution, where do we go from there? Or is there some better solution that should be proposed, or some other standard that should be applied?
Mark, I think that was your point, the point you're saying. Please turn on your mic.
Disclosure is a necessary tool because you need to identify conflicts of interest, and you need to first find out what interests are and what people are doing, and it can't be the individual. So when you get that information, then you have to analyze and see if there is a conflict of interest. If there is one, you have to see if it's a serious one or a very serious one or not. Perhaps you want to do nothing if it's not that serious, but you can't make that decision until you know what's involved. It's also a great thing because journalists can write stories and alert people. In certain cases, it allows someone to protect themselves and take action because they know there's a conflict. The problem with disclosure is, if someone's judgment is impaired, compromised because of their conflict of interest, that doesn't change. And so whatever was affecting their conduct that might have led them to produce flawed science or be biased or worse still goes on. And so if you just know this information as a reader of a study, all you can do is say, dismiss the study, but perhaps it shouldn't be there in the literature, so governments are making decisions based on it. There are potential problems with disclosure. It allows people to normalize things and think that it's not that different and we know about it. And there's now a literature of at least 50, probably by now 100 articles in the psychology literature on how people adopt to information through experiments when they know of a conflict of interest. And they often It gives them sometimes permission to think that since they've disclosed it, they can now act as an agent on their own. Other times people, if they have a relationship with a doctor and know about a conflict, they discount it. So the idea that somehow the disclosure works well is just not well founded. And the danger, therefore, is if you say, well, we've disclosed it and that ends it, you may make matters worse. But it's, and so that's one final note. Sheldon Primsky's done a wonderful series of articles with Lisa Crosgrove on looking at the journals when these things haven't been disclosed. So it's very important to disclose it, but we can't do, the cartoon I wanted to show you was Prescrire, and they have this cartoon, conflit avoué, conflit oublié, conflict disclosed, conflict disposed of and forgotten. And that's what we can't do.
Thank you. Next question, over there.
Hi, my name is Sonia Dean. I'm the editor of, the leader of the environment team and an editor at Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's international broadcaster. And I advise our team journalists to, when they're reporting on a study, a scientific study related to some environmental topic, to always make sure that it's peer-reviewed and to make sure that it's published in a legitimate scientific journal. And that combined...
Can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, combined with putting the study into context, is supposed to safeguard against not only conflicts of interest, but also, faulty information. Is a peer review a legitimate safeguard?
Marion, do you want to respond to that?
Get into the whole business of the peer review system, where peer reviewers for some journals are now, I only do food and nutrition, but there are some journals that are now asking peer reviewers to state their dietary preferences and other ideological and concerns. But what I find in the nutrition literature is that the disclosure rules are universally ignored, misinterpreted, done in completely unreasonable manners. There is not in the profession a set of standards that the profession agrees to that people need to adhere to if they're going to disclose. So it's ignored largely. And I think that's a huge problem.
You want to respond to that as well?
I work on a peer-reviewed journal. I spend my life investigating very, very well-established peer-reviewed journals. I think it's helpful to understand the model of journals, and I won't bore you about it now, but there are books written about it. But you've got to ask how journals make their money. And that is an important question in all of this. There's reprint revenue from randomized control trials. Their peer review is only as good as the peer reviewers. Okay, if you are talking about something that really isn't peer reviewed or anything else, it is a slight benchmark, but it's the least worst option. A bit like democracy, it's the least worst option. Do not rely on something solely or trust something solely because it is peer reviewed.
Okay, next question. Yeah, Daniela.
I have a very direct question because I'm also trained, I was trained as a medical doctor and I did it for a while in my life. So my question is, should we assume that any expert in medicine is biased? Should we assume that any research on drug is biased? And what's the impact of this assumption on our work as medical reporters? Because this is really something that I have to deal on a daily basis. If I assume that the best experts are all of them are involved in some way in drug research, because we don't have independent drug research. That would be very nice, but we don't have it.
Right. Yeah, Marion, you showed that pretty much all food science seems suspect, but does that mean that food industry cannot fund any science anymore, or the drug industry?
I think there's so much evidence that industry funding biases that if an industry and that the kinds of research that they're particularly interested in funding is really marketing research. It's not about science. That's a harsh statement, but I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But every scientist has biases. Every scientist. If you have a hypothesis, science is hypothesis-driven, and a hypothesis has a bias built into it. So it's not the biases that you're concerned about nearly as much as you want to know what the research question is. That's the really critical factor. Is the research question open-ended and asking a scientific question, or is it asking a marketing question? I get requests for proposals from all kinds of trade associations, explicitly stating that we have this much money for funding research that will demonstrate the benefits of our products. That's assuming a conclusion. They're only going to get studies that are designed to show benefits.
But should we just give up on industry-funded research altogether then? Is there any way that it can be done in a non-biased way?
I think there is, but I think it's impossible. The common explanation for how, or the common suggestion for what industry could do would be to pool industry funding from many, many different sources into a common pool and then have an independent third party distribute the funds. But the history of that at least in the food area, shows that what happens is the organization that's running the collection of the funds does everything that it can to please the sponsors so that the money will keep coming in over time. I think the only way to do it would be a mandatory tax on industry, proportional to the amount of profit that they make, that they put into a fund, and that fund there has to be a firewall between that fund and the industry. The industry cannot set the research agenda. The alcohol study that I started my talk with was an example of a contribution to a common fund at the National Institutes of Health. It was the National Institute of Health Foundation. Lots and lots of people, from grateful patients to very wealthy corporations, put money into that fund. But the NIH allows the donor to specify what the funding will be used for. That's a problem.
I come to the same conclusion from looking at continuing medical education in other areas, and it ends up being like a tax, or a tax where there's an obligation, so it's not voluntary of whether you contribute or not, because if you can choose not to contribute, then you've got the bias in selection, and then you have to have no control whatsoever about who does the research or what it is. So, so you can get funds from the industry, but you can't let them decide if they're going to give the funds and how it's used.
Okay, yeah?
If I may just add something. We know the funding effect exists. I mean, it's a scientific fact.
The funding means that studies that are funded by industry.
The source of funding has an impact on the results of the study. And if I may remind you that this morning we had a conversation, there was a panel about the studies that are used by regulatory agencies to regulate pesticides. And the whole regulatory system is based on studies funded by industry. So
right.
In 2018, we know that the system relies on studies that are subjected to the funding effect.
Right.
By definition.
I want to briefly give the floor to Ricio Boychev, who is a German journalist who is setting up a database, I understand, to help journalists uncover conflicts of interest. Is that right? Could you tell us what you are doing?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for giving me this opportunity. Very briefly, yes. I'm a science journalist based in Berlin, and I encountered this issue when working on an equivalent kind of project as Dollars for Dogs that probably did it in the States. So we have something similar now in Europe. And from there, the idea arose, okay, there's a database of marketing payments to doctors. Could we do something similar for scientists? And so right now, together with 3 data journalists, we are building that. We have funding from Open Knowledge Foundation in Germany, and basically we're scraping scientific literature and extracting the conflicts of interest statements, and based on that, at some point we'll have a site where you could type in the name of a scientist and see what conflicts of interest have been disclosed for this person. So it's a work in progress, but I hope by the end of this year or beginning of next year we should have
But
something.
will that help if a conflict declared is a conflict forgotten, as you said? What help is it if it's in the database?
Well, I think it's the first step. As I said, we said it's a necessary step. I think, and from there we can do, I think, interesting things. I mean, some stuff has been mentioned. I mean, finding discrepancies between what has been declared in this paper by the scientists and what has been not declared in another one, for example. So we can, I think, find many interesting clues, but then work from there as journalists.
Right. Okay. Deborah, do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, incredibly helpful. I mean, when I do my work, one of the only ways in the past has been to rely on the, as you say, in the medical literature, and even then we know that is flawed in terms of declarations. So there's lots of sources, and it's sometimes I've actually ended up just like some places require more disclosure. So I did a story about a drug called dabigatran, or Pradaxa as it's known, and I ended up being invited by the European Medicines Agency because the allegation was that Boehringer Ingelheim had withheld analyses from both the FDA and EMA. And I was invited to EMA, and there wasn't a single declaration, and I had my phone under the desk, and every single one was a key opinion leader who were presenting the data. But the FDA, it's much more rigorous. So you end up going to all sorts of sources to find it, and having that all aggregated be incredibly helpful.
Okay. Stéphane, I had a question for you. I noticed that you've also worked with the Corporate Europe Observatory. You have worked as a researcher for them, I believe. Is that compatible with your work as a journalist? I mean, at that point, don't you become an activist yourself?
Well, I understand this question. I have, of course, wondered. I mean, we've talked about it a lot before starting this collaboration, but to me, Corporate Europe Observatory is a different NGO. I would not have accepted to make a research work for Greenpeace, for example, or Pesticide Action Network. But Corporate Europe Observatory, their work is to research the influence, the corporate influence on European decision making, which is what I'm doing. And I'm no longer a freelance, but I was a freelancer, and to have the opportunity to work during 6 months, doing this amazing job. Well, I declare this. I'm in my two books. I have declarations of interest, and I declare the amounts, because this is, I think, what everybody should do. I mean, the science area, to declare the amount. Right. So there's no secret about this collaboration, and I want to make the precision that I was responsible for the editorial part, but the recommendation part I didn't participate at all. It was all Martin's job. Right. So I was not in the advocacy part of the work.
More questions from the audience? Yes, over there. We have a few more minutes.
Thank you. A very quick question. You've been speaking about conflicts of interest on industry funding. What about government funding? Is there any different way that analysis that one would apply? I mean, the most famous example is Lysenko in Russia, but I can think of examples in Brussels of commission-funded research where I question, would one think about it or treat it any differently than industry bias?
Interesting question. Who would like to respond to that? Yeah.
Usually I don't think there's a problem, but I'm assuming a liberal democratic state. But if you have a totalitarian regime with an agenda on eugenics, there's definitely a problem. And the problem that makes it different from industry is the industry clearly has a defined interest in getting a product to market or keeping it on the market. And the government may overstep on safety or keeping it on the market, but it's not living off of that product. So the kind of financial interest or bias is an entirely different order of things, I think.
What if a government wants to fund studies that support its policies, for instance?
Well, I mean, can you give me an example? I mean, in theory, yes, but usually government is not in the funding studies to support existing policies, the government doesn't have can you give me an example where that, what?
The alcohol study would be one such example.
Well, that's an industry, I view that as an industry problem rather than a government or the industry.
But the government solicited it.
Yeah, so there you have stupidity or conflicts of interest of researchers or the government being involved and in poor judgment. But the original conflict of interest is the industry has an interest in funding studies that show alcohol is safe. Government, as an initial point, has no interest one way or the other, or if anything, if they're public health seals, they'll want to show that there's a risk. So what happened there, I don't know. You need caution whenever you look at government because there can be corruption or a misjudgment. But I don't see the NIH as having a financial interest in putting out studies of a certain type.
Well, for instance, I seem to recall a situation in the Netherlands where the Dutch government wanted a study about a certain infrastructure project that they were planning to do and was basically shopping for an institute that could that they were hoping would support that policy.
In that case, if you're saying that the person in the government that's funding the research on the safety of a project that they've committed to, there I would think there is a conflict of interest. Okay. I don't think that happens a lot. I think if it was a different branch of government in charge of environmental or some safety doing a study of what some other government does, it wouldn't be. We've got something called the Government Accounting Office in the US that does studies all the time of evaluating government programs. There's a firewall, and so there are ways to have government evaluate other government programs.
Okay. Okay, briefly, and then we'll take the last question.
I agree. To compare a funding effect from a bias from the government or industries, it's two things that are not comparable. And I want to stress that it's been a strategy by industry lobbyists for in the past years to reverse the conflict of interest issue and argument. It's the world upside down. And now public academics and public researchers are accused of having a conflict of interest because they work for the public. And because their bias would be because they have to publish and they have to publish results. So they get more funding. And I've seen many scientists who work on the pesticides and the disaster of the effects of pesticides and chemicals accused of this. It's totally absurd, but it works. And it's this propaganda of using this inverted conflict of interest argument works, and is really something you should pay attention to right now.
Okay, Deborah?
Quickly, I think ultimately what are we interested in? We're interested in science and good science, bad science, if that's for want of a better expression. How much has this science been spun? How much has the study been set up to demonstrate a particular outcome? How much of the people who you've recruited been selected because they're going to give you the outcome you want? And I think industry is just one way of flagging, industry funding is one way of flagging up the risks of that. Now, that is not to say you assume stuff that is publicly funded is free from that. I've just done a story about Oxford University where data was spun because they wanted to be the first to release a new BCG vaccine onto the market. So ultimately, if you have in the back of your mind, and the UK, I mean, we've seen with Brexit, there's constantly kind of spun documents that are coming out to kind of support government policy in particular areas. And in the Department of Health, they will have studies to show a particular intervention has worked in their favour. So ultimately, I think when you're evaluating science, evaluate it from a point of critical thought. And industry funding is one of those ways of flagging up kind of a risk of bias, because there's a risk of bias tool with industry funding and publication bias that academics use.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Yes, over there.
Beth Baker, PLOS. What would you like to see us, journalists, others, do, or what more would you like to see us do to inform the public about conflicts of interest and to educate them about how to evaluate them?
Okay, great question. Let's have 10 words from each of the speakers and then we'll...
I think in the UK we've got to start. America's a bit better at doing this. Sorry if I just jumped in. I've just got some... We've got to ask them. And the UK were terrible terrible about doing it. BMJ doesn't do it, and I pointed that out to Fiona Godley when we were doing a news story. It's much more routinely done in some of the US, like Medscape and MedPage Today, and New York Times do it quite well. We should ask people and include it in our story. That is just one easy thing to do.
Okay, Stéphane, what is your one easy or difficult thing to do?
It's both easy and difficult. It's the same. I mean, all journalists should ask or investigate about the conflicts of interest of the scientists they interview or quote, and quote these conflicts of interest in the articles. There's a space problem. Right. But in France, there's a law but, stating that we journalists should do that. Well, scientists should declare and scientists should disclose, but it's not respected.
Okay, Marc, your one tip for science journalists?
The hardest thing to do and most important is report on ways to avoid conflicts of interest and how the system needs to be changed. What you'll probably end up doing is just exposing the conflicts of interest and identifying them. That's also valuable.
Marion, your tip in addition to, of course, buying your book? Just to turn on the microphone, please. Your microphone. Marion, your microphone.
Whoops. Ask who funded the study and ask whether the authors had some kind of financial relationship with the company that's funding the study or with similar companies. And you might also try that with sources.
All right. Thank you very much for these excellent talks, and thank you for your questions and your attention.
Thank you, Martin. That was an amazing session. So we're almost done here. We just want to say that this discussion will continue next year in Toulouse, in Lausanne, as you understood, where we're going to have a world conference. And before giving the floor to Olivier to to draw the two people from here who will go to that conference, we just want to show you a little movie to give you a little insight of what you'll get there.
It all started with a challenge. We were looking for a symbolic action to illustrate our project, bringing together the World Conference of Science Journalists in Lausanne, Switzerland in 2019, an event for which our 3 associations of science journalists from Switzerland, France, and Italy joined their ideas and forces. Then the challenge came. Let's go to the exact point where the borders of our 3 countries meet. Well, this point happens to be the summit of Monde, 12,543 feet high in the Alps. So we carefully planned this long-haul journey. Like the organization of the conference, we knew the trek would need a collaborative effort. Climbing together, we would exchange ideas about the right path to follow. Climbing together, we would find the right tools to use and the best decisions to take. We could share our enthusiasm and goodwill with all of you, our colleagues across the world. We shared a single goal, reaching new heights together, both on the mountain and in science journalism. Arriving at the summit, just as for this next World Conference, we step outside the context of our daily routines. We see farther in the open sky and take time to think differently.
Let's reach new heights together!
this is the small video we produced for last year. If I get it out, no, not again. Yeah, here we go. So to present the conference in San Francisco, the last conference. So you get the main messages, but I'll just update you on where. No, that's not the one. On where we stand now, and present you more details about the conference in the last 2 minutes I have. So you get the main message, reaching new heights in science journalism. We have set up a kind of tentative program with similar days like today, so keynotes at the beginning, at the end, parallel session during the day. The lunch at labs I'll talk about very soon, etc. The field trips. It's important today for us, well, actually tomorrow, because tomorrow the program committee out of 15 science journalists from the entire world will choose the 45 parallel session out of the 400 we got from the call for proposals we made. And we will also choose, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next weeks or months, the plenary and keynote sessions for the conference. Sorry about that. The session will, the conference will be held in the Swiss Tech Convention Center. So that's just everything under one roof, which is great because this can assure you that you will actually meet your conference friends and so on. So everything will be under one roof in a really modern location and venue in Lausanne. This location, this venue is on the campus. That's the EPFL University of Lausanne campus, 25,000 scientists altogether on the lakeshore close to Lausanne. It's 10 minutes with the metro. So it's a great luck to be on the campus because at each lunch breaks we will organize about 30 lab visits for 10 to 15 people. That means almost 500 people going to the labs every lunch, eating a sandwich, having a drink, but speaking with the scientists, seeing the labs, etc. So great occasions to bring stories, science stories back home. And if you need more, there'll be some field trips all around Switzerland, even further to France, to Germany, France, that's Paris, Lyon, Grenoble, Chamonix, not sure yet, but we'll try. Italy, Germany, and even further to Jordan, because we might have a field trip to Sisimi, you know, the synchrotron light source in Amman. So again, many possibilities to get stories, science stories home. We will, and this is new, I think, we'll have a kind of, well, the exhibition is not new, but what we will launch next year is a kind of a media startup roadshow. So it's about 15 media startups that will be there to present their product and bring, you know, all of you in small workshops to test the product, etc. So again, something really useful for journalists to test, to get new tools and to simplify our job. Social events every evening, I won't go deep on that, just to mention the 2nd of July, the Olympic Museum, where we will have an opening cocktail, and on the 4th of July, we'll have a party. We rented for that the whole village in the Lavaux Vineyard regions, for those who know that, UNESCO World Heritage. So we rent the village, and you'll be able to get some wine testing while meeting people. So we have many information channels, the website, the newsletter. Please do register if you want to be updated on the infos of the conference, social networks as well. You have the names there. Just to sum up, so about 200 speakers. We will also have 100 travel grants, mainly for you know, science journalists coming from developing countries, but not only. About 1,000 participants are expected. Be one of them. Registration open next year, end of January, and actually we will have something special. You just mentioned this already, the buddy story. So I let you present it. If
so, here we have the names of all the pairs of conference buddies who tweeted their picture. And Olivier's innocent hand is going to draw a pair, and they will be invited. They will get their 2 tickets to Lausanne next summer.
it's going to be this one. So if you recognize yourself, Viviane Thivan. She's here. And Mohamed El Said. Which means you get a full grant to Lausanne, travel. Whoa. I'm sorry. Okay. Travel and accommodation in Lausanne, and everything's paid for you, both of you. So we could have made a diploma or a fake ticket. It's all right. We didn't have time, but we still have two very valuable things because those chocolate things disappeared quite quickly today. So these are the last two probably. So this is your ticket to Lausanne next year.
No, let them come and receive their tickets. So you must come and receive your tickets. And somebody please make a picture for posterity. So thank you very much for coming, all of you. Let me just say a word about how we're going to proceed now. We have a party at 8 p.m. at the Museum of Natural History. Everybody who's here is invited, and you can bring someone or maybe even several people if you like. So it's very easy to find the Museum of Natural History. I mean, Google knows how to do that. If you want to take the metro, it's at the Metro Carmes, C-A-R-M-E-S, which is 5 stations from here, direct on the B line. You don't change, you just get off at the Metro Carmes, and then you go to the Natural History Museum. If you're just fed up with sitting down, it's a 40-minute walk. That's what Google says, so it's probably a little less. So anyway, we'll see you there at 8, and there will be food and drink and celebration. Thank you very much.